There was a morning in May 1291 when the last city that stood between the crusading enterprise and its complete erasure from the earth woke to a sound that everyone inside its walls had known was coming, and that no amount of knowing made bearable when it finally arrived. The sound of 600 siege engines releasing simultaneously a percussion so total that contemporaries described it not as noise, but as physical transformation of the air itself, a pressure wave that shook the stones of the walls and the bones of the people behind them, and announced with the finality of a door closing forever that the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil had decided that 2 centuries of Crusader presence on the Syrian coast would end here on this day. Against these walls in the city was Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, a port city of perhaps 40,000 souls crammed into its final defensive perimeter. And what makes this morning uniquely devastating in the long chronicle of Crusader failure is not the military mechanics of the assault, overwhelming as they were. It is the specific quality of the abandonment that preceded it. Because Acre did not fall because Christendom tried to save it and failed it, fell because Christendom had already decided, through a decade of political paralysis and competing priority, and the simple exhaustion of an enterprise that had been bleeding treasure and lives for nearly 2 centuries, that Acre was not worth saving. And the question the rubble of those walls has been asking since May 18th, 1291, is not military, it is moral. What does it mean when a civilization loses, not because it was defeated, but because it stopped caring enough to fight? The Crusader state that contracted to its final perimeter at Acre in 1291 had been dying of its own contradictions for decades before the Mamluk army arrived to deliver the final blow, because the kingdom that had once stretched from the Taurus Mountains to the Sinai had been systematically dismantled, not only by external military pressure, but by the internal pathologies that had characterized the Crusader enterprise from its founding. The factional warfare between the Italian merchant communes of Venice and Genoa that had produced literal street battles inside Acre's walls in the War of St. Sabas in the 1250s. The jurisdictional disputes between the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights, whose rivalry was so entrenched that they sometimes supported opposing sides in regional conflicts, and the progressive disengagement of European political attention. As the papacy that had launched the crusading movement became consumed by its conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, and as the French and English monarchies turned their military energy toward each other, and the Mamluk Sultanate that delivered the killing blow was itself a creation of the crusading era, a military slave dynasty of Turkic and Circassian origin that had risen through the Ayyubid Egyptian military apparatus, and that had demonstrated at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 that it could stop the Mongols, making it simultaneously the power that saved the Islamic Middle East from the Mongol destruction and the power that would systematically eliminate the Crusader coastal remnant over the following 3 decades. The assault on Acre that began in April 1291 with al-Ashraf Khalil's army, which the sources place at somewhere between 60,000 and 220,000 men, a variance that reveals the mythologizing impulse operating on both sides, but that in any realistic assessment represented an overwhelming numerical superiority over the defending garrison of perhaps 14,000 soldiers, proceeded with a methodical and relentless efficiency that reflected the Mamluk military system at the peak of its organizational sophistication. The 600 mangonels and trebuchets that had been transported to the siege lines began systematic destruction of the outer walls, and the tunneling operations that Mamluk engineers ran beneath the towers produced collapses that no repair effort could keep pace with, and on May 18th, the outer wall gave way. And the street fighting that followed inside Acre is described in the sources from both sides with a specificity of horror, the Templar Marshal Matthew of Clermont dying in the streets, the Hospitaller Master Jean de Villiers, wounded and evacuated by sea, and the Templar headquarters holding as the last defensive position, while civilians were evacuated to the ships in the harbor, holding until its undermined foundations collapsed on attackers and defenders alike, burying the end of the Crusader states in literal rubble. The uncomfortable archaeology of Acre's fall runs in directions that complicate the tragedy narrative, because the Mamluk campaign that eliminated the Crusader coastal cities in the years around 1291 did not simply conquer them, it systematically destroyed them. The ports of Acre and Caesarea and Arsuf and Jaffa were demolished so thoroughly that their harbors could not be used for generations, a deliberate strategic decision to prevent any future Crusader force from using them as bridgeheads. And this destruction, while militarily rational from the Mamluk perspective, also eliminated urban infrastructure and economic systems that had served the local population regardless of who governed them. And the Crusader states themselves had never been the purely extractive colonial enterprise that the most aggressive modern critique presents. They had developed hybrid administrative and commercial systems in which the local Christian and Muslim populations participated in arrangements of considerable complexity. Not equitable arrangements, Not arrangements that the subjected populations would have chosen freely, but arrangements that were not simple occupation either. And the fall of Acre ended those arrangements by ending the cities entirely. And the coast, that had been one of the most commercially active zones in the medieval Mediterranean, went dark. And the people who had lived and traded there across 2 centuries, regardless of which flag flew above the walls, had nowhere to go that was not worse than what they had lost. What ended at Acre in May 1291 was not merely a military campaign or a political project, but the central organizing myth of 12th and 13th century European civilization. The idea that Christendom was an active and expansive force capable of projecting military power to the edges of the known world and holding territory in the name of a shared identity. And the loss of that myth produced consequences across European intellectual and political culture. The crisis of confidence in papal leadership that the crusading failures accelerated contributed to the conditions that produced the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism, the military orders that had been founded specifically for the crusading enterprise, lost their institutional justification overnight and spent the following decades in political crisis. The Templars dissolved in a purge of spectacular violence within 20 years of Acre's fall. And the idea of a new crusade to recover the Holy Land circulated in European political discourse for the next 2 centuries. A project that every monarch endorsed and no monarch funded adequately. A ghost enterprise, haunting the budgets and the rhetoric of European statecraft long after any realistic possibility of execution had evaporated. And today, the archaeological site of ancient Acre, the Crusader city that lies largely intact beneath the modern Israeli city of Akko, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, where tourists descend into the Crusader-era tunnels and photograph the stone halls of the Hospitaller compound and stand in rooms where the last defenders of the last Crusader city made their final preparations, and the stones say nothing about whether the enterprise that built them was holy or imperial or both simultaneously. And the harbor where the evacuation ships departed on May 18th, 1291, is a tourist marina now, and the question the water carries is the question that every civilization's final fortress eventually forces upon the people who come after, which is this: when you have spent 2 centuries and a generation of the blood building something on ground that was never yours to keep, and the ground takes it back, what exactly have you lost, and what did you never actually have, and is there a difference that matters to the people who paid the cost of the confusion?